Welcome to Restoria, your cozy corner for gentle bedtime stories. My name is James and I'll be your host tonight. Every night, we bring you peaceful tales designed to calm your mind and help you drift off into a deep, restful sleep. So snuggle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. The story tonight is called Foglit Harbor. Chapter 1. The Bells Beyond the Mist. The sea was a flat sheet of silver when Corin loosened the tiller and let the boat drift. No destination, no hurry. Just the endless, slow sway of water beneath him and the thick roll of mist ahead. He'd been at sea longer than he could count, not in days or distance, but in the weight of quiet hours. Somewhere behind him were places he'd meant to leave. Somewhere ahead were places he didn't yet have the strength to imagine. He leaned back against the worn wood of his boat, closed his eyes, and listened. That's when he heard them. Bells. Faint at first, not the sharp clang of harbor warnings, nor the cheerful chime of celebration. These bells rang low and steady, like breathing made of sound. Corin opened his eyes. The mist shifted in ribbons, revealing glimmers of golden light ahead. Lanterns, tied to docks that shouldn't be there. He sat up, adjusting the sail just slightly. The boat responded like an old friend nudged awake. The current, too, seemed to pull him forward, guiding him without rush or command. As he drew closer, shapes emerged. Floating houses bobbing gently. Docks stitched together with thick rope. Small bridges and platforms, linking them all like a patchwork quilt across the bay. At the heart of it all was a sign, swinging from a crooked post, Foglit Harbor. Below that, in smaller hand-painted letters, a place for breath between journeys. Corin smiled despite himself. The boat thudded softly against a dock. No one rushed to meet him. No harbor master shouted orders. Only the mist welcomed him, curling in cool spirals around the planks. A lantern swayed above, its golden light steady in the shifting fog. Corin tied off his boat and stepped ashore. The dock creaked under his boots, a sound more familiar than any conversation he'd had in months. Ahead, a woman stood near a small booth made of driftwood, wrapped in a heavy shawl, her hair silver and loose down her back. She held a cup of something steaming and watched him approach with a kind smile. "Long sail?" she asked, voice soft enough that it didn't disturb the fog. "Long enough," Corin answered. She nodded, as if that explained everything. "Room to rest if you want it. Tea if you need it. No names unless you offer them." He hesitated only a moment before following her down a narrow bridge to a low, floating house with a wide front porch and a battered sign that read Hearthlight Inn. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and salt. A fire crackled in a small hearth. Worn armchairs huddled around low tables stacked with books and knitted blankets. The woman handed him a key attached to a smooth stone etched with a simple word. "Stay. Second door on the left," she said. "The harbor rocks a little at night. Don't mind it." Corin nodded, too tired to speak. His room was small bare wood. A narrow bed layered with heavy quilts. a window fogged at the corners. On the bedside table sat a small lantern already lit, its light steady but low. Corin set down his bag half empty, half forgotten, and sat on the edge of the bed. He listened. The bells still rang somewhere beyond the mist. The harbor rocked gently, the creak of the docks like an old lullaby. He didn't undress, didn't unpack. He simply lay down, pulled the quilt to his chin, and let the sound of Foglit Harbor wrap around him. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping the floating village in silver, and Corin, drifting towards sleep, thought, maybe some places aren't meant to be found on maps. Maybe some places are meant to find you. Chapter 2. The Slow Morning Light. Corin woke to a softness he couldn't name. Not the kind of waking that comes with alarm bells or the clang of ship rigging. This was different. The air itself seemed to breathe, the harbor rocking just enough to remind him he was floating, not anchored to any land at all. Light leaked around the edges of the curtains, not sharp sunlight, but a muted silver glow. A light that asked nothing of him. He stretched beneath the heavy quilt, feeling muscles he'd forgotten start to uncurl. There was no rush, no knock at the door. Just the faint sound of water tapping the sides of the inn and the low hum of distant bells slipping through the fog. Corin sat up slowly. On the small bedside table, next to the lantern that had burned low overnight, sat a fresh pot of tea and a folded slip of paper. The note, written in a careful hand, read, "When you're ready, step outside. The harbor waits in its own time." He smiled. He didn't rush. Instead, he poured the tea warm and sweet, with a hint of something floral, and sat by the window. The harbor outside was a quiet dream. Floating houses bobbed softly in place, connected by thin bridges and wide docks. Lanterns hung low on curved poles, casting golden halos that barely touched the mist below. Now and then a figure would pass, a man in a dark coat carrying a basket of bread, a child with a scarf too big for their face, a woman in yellow boots walking a small white dog that trotted carefully along the planks. None of them hurried. None of them seemed to mind the thick silver air. Corin dressed and stepped outside. The wooden planks were cool under his boots, damp from mist but not slippery. A path of floating bridges stretched out like lazy arms, linking homes and shops and hidden nooks he couldn't yet see. The woman from the night before stood at the inn's porch, sipping from a clay mug. She lifted it in a kind of silent salute. Corin nodded back. He wandered, letting the harbor guide him. Past a row of houses painted in muted color soft blues, faded greens, the gentle tan of driftwood. Past a crooked dock where a fisherman sat mending a net that looked like it had caught more stories than fish. Past a narrow archway where a small handwritten sign read, "Messages to nowhere, in particular deliveries welcome." Corin found himself at a wide platform overlooking open water. Two benches sat facing the fog, empty but waiting. He sat, The mist shifted and breathed around him. He didn't need to think, didn't need to plan. He just watched. From somewhere unseen came the soft sounds of life. A spoon clinking against a cup, the distant pluck of a stringed instrument, a gentle splash where someone stepped into a boat, and underneath it all, always, the slow, steady bells. He closed his eyes, breathed in the salt and cedar and something sweeter, like lavender, soaked in rain. For the first time, in what felt like a long, long while, Corin realized he didn't need to go anywhere. He was already here. After a while, he rose. The harbor didn't press him. It didn't call him back. It only waited, the way mist waits on still water. As he crossed back toward the inn, a small girl skipped past him, clutching a paper lantern shaped like a star. She laughed not loudly, but like a pebble dropping into a pond, and the sound curled through the fog. Corin smiled. Back at the Hearthlight Inn, he found another note pinned to the doorframe. Dinner by the fire. Join if you wish. No need to speak unless the words find you. He tucked the note into his pocket. The bells rang softly, a heartbeat made of mist. And Corin, who had spent so long drifting without knowing what he sought, found himself finally quietly at rest. Chapter 3. The Fire by the Water. By the time evening rolled in, the mist had thickened again, weaving between the houses and over the docks like a slow-moving tide of silver. Corin stood on the porch of the Hearthlight Inn, the paper note crumpled softly in his pocket, and watched as golden lanterns blinked into life one by one. Somewhere deep in the harbor, a low bell sounded not urgent, just present, like a reminder that time moved differently here. He followed the narrow bridges that looped and curved like the branches of an old tree, his boots tapping quietly against the damp wood. The fire was easy to find. Set in a large stone ring at the heart of the harbor, it burned low and steady. People gathered around it, sailors and shopkeepers, old women with embroidered shawls, children wrapped in blankets, all perched on benches and crates, sipping from steaming mugs. No one spoke loudly. Conversations, when they happened, were murmurs beneath the crackle of flame. Corin hesitated at the edge, but a woman with a sun-lined face patted the bench beside her without a word, and he took the invitation. Someone passed him a mug. The tea inside smelled of cloves and smoke, with a twist of something sweeter underneath, maybe pear, maybe honey. Corin sipped and let the warmth spread through his chest. The fire threw long shadows against the mist. The reflections trembled in the still water beyond, so it seemed as though the fire floated both above and below the harbor. Now and then, a new figure would emerge from the fog, join the circle, and settle in as naturally as a bird finding a branch. One man strummed a small guitar, fingers lazy over the strings. The music barely rose above the hiss of the fire, but filled the space between heartbeats. Corin felt the stiffness inside him, the part that had kept him always alert, always ready to move, begin to loosen. He leaned back. Let the fog wrap around him. Let the fire's warmth reach the parts of him that the sea wind had left cold. Somewhere across the circle, a girl with hair like a raven's wing folded paper shape as small boats. Stars, crane sand placed them carefully along the rim of the stone fire ring. Each time she placed one, the flame seemed to bend toward it, briefly illuminating the folds. Corn watched until his eyes grew heavy. Someone began humming a tune he didn't know but somehow recognized all the same, like something from a half-remembered dream. When the mug in his hands grew empty, he set it on the dock beside him. No one spoke when he rose. No one needed to. The path back to the inn was marked by small floating lanterns, each one drifting just above the mist, tethered by invisible threads. As he walked, the bells sounded again, a different rhythm this time. A slower call, like a good night, sung to the tide. At his door, another small note waited, tucked into the slats. There is no wrong pace here, only the one your heart is ready for. Inside, the lantern still burned softly. Corin slipped out of his boots, shrugged off his jacket, and slid beneath the waiting quilt. As he drifted toward sleep, the last thing he heard was the fire's crackle, still humming somewhere out across the water, stitched together with the steady, patient bells. He smiled without meaning to, and the harbor, wrapped in mist and memory, smiled back. Chapter 4. Maps Without Names. The next morning, Corin woke before the mist lifted. The harbor was still a cradle of silver, the outlines of houses and docks soft and blurred. It would have been easy to stay inside, tucked beneath the warm quilt with a book and a second pot of tea. But something pulled at him, a curiosity as steady as the bells. He dressed, pocketed a slice of bread from the breakfast tray left at his door, and stepped into the mist. Today he took a different path. Past the cafe on the boat, the smell of fresh scones already tempting the air past, the archway that promised messages to nowhere in particular. At the end of a thin dock, just before the open bay, sat a squat building with a sign carved into driftwood. Cartography for the Quiet Heart. Corin pushed open the door. Inside, the walls were covered in maps. Not ordinary ones. There were no country names, no borders, no compass roses, just flowing shapes lands drawn with watercolor edges, seas painted in deep greens and smoky blues, rivers curling like ink trails. A woman sat at a low table, her gray hair tied in a loose knot, brushing careful strokes across parchment. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that said she'd been expecting him. Looking for somewhere? She asked. Maybe, Corin said. Or maybe just seeing what's here. She nodded, as if that was the better answer. She rose and gestured toward a wall lined with narrow drawers. Every traveler has a map, she said, even if they don't know it yet. Corin watched as she opened a drawer and pulled out a rolled scroll tied with a blue ribbon. This one, she said, handing it to him. He untied the ribbon carefully. The map unrolled into a sweep of misty color shores edged in pale light, forests that bled into sky, rivers that circled without hurry. In the center, written in small, neat letters, was a single phrase, "Where the heart unanchors." Corin traced the path of the river with one fingertip. "Is this a real place?" he asked. "Real enough," the woman said. "If it feels like yours, it's yours." He didn't ask what that meant. He knew. It wasn't about finding a place. It was about recognizing it. He spent the morning wandering the shop. Maps of sleeping islands. Maps of cities built from echoes. Maps of roads that curled back on themselves, ending not in arrival but in rest. He found a small one tucked between two larger scrolls, a map of a single boat on an endless misty sea, a tiny lantern bobbing above it. The caption read, "For when the journey is the destination." He tucked it into his coat. The woman smiled but said nothing. Outside, the mist was thinning slightly, the air growing brighter. Corin made his way back toward the center of the harbor, heart lighter than it had been in a long while. The paper in his pocket felt warm, like it carried something alive. Back at the Hearthlight Inn, another note waited at his door. "The harbor is wide, the heart wider still." He smiled as he tucked the map onto the table beside his lantern. Then he pulled the quilt around his shoulders and sat by the window, watching the mist drift and breathe. Somewhere out in the gray, bells rang a slow, patient rhythm. A song for travelers who had finally remembered how to be still. Chapter 5. The Dock of Quiet Wishes. By late afternoon, a hush even deeper than the mist settled over Foglit Harbor. Corin wandered down a dock he hadn't explored before, drawn by the rhythm of soft chimes and the scent of salt, sweet air. The path narrowed, wobbling slightly underfoot, until it ended at a small platform barely big enough for two people to stand side by side. Set into the center of the dock was a shallow brass bowl filled with folded slips of paper weighted down by smooth river stones. Above it, a hand-carved sign read, "Wishes without deadlines." Corin crouched, careful not to tip the dock, and picked up a folded slip. The paper was thin, almost translucent. He unfolded it. "I hope someday the world feels as soft as this harbor." He smiled. "Another? Let me remember how to listen before I speak." And another. "I wish for one good breath when I forget how to take one." Each wish was small, gentle, no desperate pleas or grand declarations, just quiet hopes whispered into paper and left for the fog to carry. A stub of pencil rested nearby. Corin thought for a long time. Then he wrote, "To trust the stillness as much as I trust the wind." He folded the paper carefully, weighted it with a stone, and left it with the others. The mist shifted around him, cool and familiar. He stayed a while, sitting cross-legged, watching the water breathe against the posts. Other figures passed quietly along the dock, some alone, some hand in hand, all pausing to add their own hopes. A woman tucked a wish beneath a stone and brushed her fingers lightly over the bowl's rim, as if sealing the prayer in place. A child placed a folded drawing instead of words, a crayon sun beaming from the page. No one spoke. No one needed to. When Corin finally rose, his knees creaking, he felt lighter. Not because anything had changed, but because he'd remembered that wishing wasn't about asking. It was about letting go. The bells sounded softly through the mist. He made his way back to the inn, heart quietly full. At his door, another note waited. Some journeys are made by standing still. Inside, he set his boots by the window, lit the small lantern, and sipped tea that tasted faintly of mint and rain. He watched the mist curl around the harbor, listened to the creak of the docks, and let his breath match the slow, patient rhythm of the tide. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, there was only here, and it was enough. Chapter 6. A Boat That Waited. Corin woke to a morning wrapped in deep, heavy fog. The kind that pressed against the windows and muted even the sound of the bells. It made everything feel softer, closer, as if the harbor itself was breathing slowly in its sleep. He dressed warmly and stepped outside, the chill dampness brushing his cheeks. Today, the harbor was different, quieter still. The lanterns along the docks glowed faintly, like stars struggling to stay lit at the edge of dawn. He wandered, without thinking, letting the creaks and shifts of the planks guide him. Near the far edge of the harbor, where the docks grew narrower and the mist thickened, he found a small skiff bobbing at the end of a rope. A note was pinned to the mast, written in the same hand as all the others, for the one ready to drift. Corin hesitated, one hand resting on the dock post. The boat swayed gently, as if inviting, not demanding. Without really deciding, he stepped in. The skiff rocked but didn't tip. He settled onto the worn wooden seat, and the mist swallowed him whole. There were no oars, no sail, only the soft sound of water slipping past the hull and the steady pulse of his own breathing. The harbor faded into a blur of lanterns and shadow. Corin sat back, letting the boat drift where it would. Minutes passed, or hours. He lost track. Time here was less a line and more a tide moving in its own rhythm, beyond the need to measure. The mist thickened, then thinned. Shapes appeared. Another dock, a small cottage perched on a floating island of reeds, a narrow bridge arcing over nothingness. Each time, the boat drifted past, slow and sure. He felt memories stir not of places he'd been, but of feelings he thought he'd forgotten. The comfort of a hand resting on his shoulder, the laughter of friends he hadn't seen in years, the quiet pride of reaching a place not marked on any map. He let it all move through him, like water through open hands. When the boat finally bumped against a familiar dock, Corin opened his eyes. He was back. Foglit Harbor blinked softly through the mist, its lanterns steady, its houses huddled together like old friends. The same dock where he had first tied his boat. The same welcoming glow. He stepped out, boots landing with a soft thud on the damp planks. A small slip of paper fluttered against a post, pinned by a seashell. Sometimes drifting is how we remember where we are. Corin tucked it into his coat pocket. He didn't need to rush. The harbor would wait. It always had. And tonight, as the mist thickened and the bells sang low, Corin knew he would sleep deeper than he had in years. Because now, he wasn't lost. He was simply here. Chapter 7. The Lanterns That Stayed. Morning came slow and golden. The mist hadn't fully lifted, but it thinned enough to let sunlight drip between the houses and over the water, turning everything into a soft blur of light and reflection. Corin sat on the front porch of the Hearthlight Inn, a mug of warm tea cradled in his hands. Today felt different. Not rushed, not final, just full. The harbor bustled in its own quiet way. A woman hung wind chimes made from driftwood and shell. Children chased each other across the planks, their laughter muffled but bright. Someone tuned a small guitar near the fire circle, the notes floating like lazy butterflies. Corin finished his tea and stood. He walked the docks one last time, past the messages to nowhere booth where new notes had already appeared, fluttering softly. Past the brass bowl of wishes without deadlines, the pile of folded papers grown taller since his last visit. Past the small cartography shop, its door open, a fresh map pinned to the window labeled simply, Paths Yet to Be Walked. Each place he passed hummed with life. Not loud, but steady. He found himself standing at the dock where his own boat waited, bobbing gently against the posts. The woman with the silver hair, the one who had welcomed him, first appeared beside him, holding a lantern. "Leaving?" she asked. Corin smiled. Maybe just carrying the harbor with me for a while." She nodded. That's all it ever asks. She pressed the lantern into his hands. It was simply a small orb of glass, the light inside it soft and golden, as if someone had bottled a piece of sunrise. "For the nights when the mist finds you," she said, "and you forget for a moment that you're never really lost." Corin tucked the lantern into his satchel. He climbed into his boat. The rope slipped free with a soft splash, and the current caught the hull like a hand finding its place. He drifted slowly away from Foglit Harbor. No one waved. No one called out. But he felt the harbor with him in the hush of the water, in the patient curve of the mist, in the steady beat of his own heart. As he passed the last lantern post, he looked back. The harbor faded into silver and gold, houses and bridges and docks melting into the morning light. But the bells rang once more, clear and low, threading through the mist like a promise. Corin smiled. Ahead, the sea stretched wide and open. Behind him, the harbor stayed. Not as a place he'd left, but as a place he carried now, a quiet anchor inside him, always steady, always waiting. And somewhere beyond the mist, new shores waited too. But first, First he would drift. First he would listen. First he would remember how good it felt to move slow, to breathe deep, to be exactly where he was. And the lantern in his satchel glowed softly against his side, a small sun that would never burn out. Not while he remembered. Not while he carried the harbor with him.